true is that before engaging in the process of looking for a solution provider, it's really important to make sure that your own house is in order to begin with. So how do you know you're ready to reach out and engage with these partners in the first place? Now, what I want to do is spend a couple of minutes talking about what I call the buying dynamic. And I think this is the crux of the reason why the majority of the projects that get funded ultimately fail. And at its core, this is a psychological process. So what I would do is ask you to kind of open your mind up a little bit as we go through this, because if you fall into the trap that I'm going to talk about in this buying dynamic, there's a high probability that the project you're about to embark upon is doomed before you even start. Right? So what I want to do is I want to look at two elements as it relates to any given project. The first is risk. So how much risk does both the solution provider and you as the customer carry over the duration of the sales process or the buying process? And then I want to look at the amount of time it takes to move from interest through to contract closure and how that risk changes and what the implications are to both parties. So if you look at the buyer, many of you in the listening audience today, at the beginning of a selection process, there really is limited to no risk at all. You've defined some requirements. You're starting to go to the vendor community to look at who might have an offering for you, which local suppliers have done this body of work in the past. It's an exploratory stage. The sellers, on the other hand, the organizations that you're going to be reaching out to, their risk at the beginning of these processes is actually exceptionally high. They don't know very much about you as a client, a potential client. They don't know what your requirements are. They don't know what your budget is. They don't know if they've worked in this industry or solved these specific problems before. And so their risk at the beginning of the selection process is exceptionally high. Now, at some point along the way, there will be a decision to move forward with one solution provider. And what I want to look at is what happens to the risk lines of the buyer and the seller as we get closer to that decision point, and then what kind of impact that has on the success probability of the project overall. Now, what I know to be true, having spent the better part of my career on the selling side of things, is that as we get closer and closer to the decision point, my risk significantly decreases. I learn more about what the buyer is looking for. And I can answer questions like, have I worked in this industry before? Do I have a clear understanding of what the executives are trying to accomplish at an economic level? Can I point to other implementations where I've done this body of work? Have I uncovered enough of the business challenges to know that this is going to be a project that's going to be funded? Any point along that risk line, I have the option of saying, you know what, we're not a good fit for this opportunity, let's simply disengage and point the buyer towards a solution set that's more appropriate. So as I get closer to the decision point, my risk actually decreases. Now what happens on the buyer side is quite the opposite. So as they continue to learn more, see more product presentations, meet more solution providers, as they get closer to the decision point, their risk line actually increases over time, up into a point where fundamentally those two lines meet. Now, in that period prior to a decision, there is a significant gap. And it's not just a gap in risk. It's a perceived risk that what I experience from buyers is that they don't want to share too much with potential suppliers that they're going to be embracing once they move through the decision-making process. And so there's a reluctance to provide access to executives. There's a reluctance to provide deep discovery. There's more of a preference to document on paper what it is they're looking for from a capabilities perspective, and then throwing that over the fence to fundamentally to the various solution providers that you're speaking with, for fear that if they learn too much, then it will somehow impact their pricing. Okay? So what we know after the decision is that the actual risk of the selling community pretty much disappears. So if I'm successful enough to be awarded the business, my risk disappears because I'm now going to be moving into a contract phase where I'll be providing services and getting paid for those over a period of time. Now, if I'm not the successful seller, my risk also disappears Now, I may feel upset about that and go into a dark room and feel sorry for myself for a couple of days, but I am a selling professional, and so I'll dust myself off and I'll go out and I'll find some new opportunities to pursue, and hopefully I'll learn from my experience. Right? So, but the risk radically changes for the selling community after the decision point. Now, not so true for the buying community, because if you look back at, again, the Standish Group data, on average, projects cost twice as much and take twice as long. I always ask the question, is there a top end to the volume of risk that you will potentially experience after you make a decision? The short answer is no. If we go back to the Standish data, 19% of all of the projects that are funded are canceled outright. That's a pretty significant number, right? So we have to ask ourselves, where is the actual risk in the buying process? The risk doesn't sit in the period of time where you're engaging with the solution providers. The risk actually sits after you've made that decision. So we kind of look at the buying dynamic through those eyes. The selling community, the business partners that are out there putting together the proposals and the quotes that are setting your expectations internally, the accuracy of that proposal is going to be dependent upon the access that you give them and the data that you give them, in that period of time where you're watching product demonstration. It doesn't sit on the backside of things. So if you look at the duration of time that most organizations spend in that evaluation discovery process, it's roughly 6 months. If you look at the amount of time they actually own the software and its useful life, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 10 years. So I want you to think about that for just a second. We spend 6 months looking at software, we spend 6 to 10 years using it, and yet in this period of exploration, we want to limit the ability or the access that the solution providers have to the organization as they try to craft an accurate proposal. Now, while I say the risk of the selling community decreases after the decision, that's not entirely true. Because the reality is if the proposal is not accurate, then there's a significant amount of risk that the selling community also adopts as they work with you as a client to try to make that project successful. But it's not an easy process. So the crux of all of this, so how does this happen? Right? I call it the illusion of control. So for that 6-month period, I see a lot of organizations try to control the selling organizations as we try to uncover what it is that you're trying to accomplish at the business level. And while you have that 6 months of the illusion of control, unfortunately the price you pay for that after the fact is a significant increase in the volume of risk that your organization carries moving forward. And so it's a bit of a complicated slide. It's fundamentally rooted in people's psychology. And what is it really saying at the end of the day? What am I really trying to net out here? Is that to be successful, to get into the 35% that are successful and measurably successful, we need to be a little bit more trusting and open with the solution providers at the front end of this process so that we can decrease the risk that we carry moving forward.
It always befuddles me too, because some of the solution providers we've met the guys at Broadpoint and MyBar and people like that, have so much to offer in terms of creativity and ideas, and the fact that they've seen so many of these. And when a customer keeps them distant, when a prospect, keeps them distant so they can't get the information, they actually can't bring all of that insight and intellect into the conversation and help with the decision-making process. It's kind of interesting.
I would agree, George. And without beating this horse too much to death, this is the crux of why projects fail. Partner solution providers go into every single one of these engagements wanting to learn as much as they possibly can and to put together as an accurate an estimate as they possibly can. If they are chosen and that proposal is wrong, both them and ultimately the customer is at significant risk.